Hello. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much for bearing with us with the weird technical issue we had. And thank you everyone who's coming in and listening. Sorry, we're going to start a couple minutes late because we had a funny kind of technical glitch. So I'm just going to let people come in and then we'll get started.
So great to meet you.
Yeah, I know, really. I've read obviously a lot of your stuff. So yeah, it's really nice to finally meet you.
That was one of the impetus for sharing one of my newer pieces because I read your piece and it was like, oh, I'll share something new. Maybe it'll prompt a good conversation. So
yeah, for sure. I'm excited about it.
I apologize. My allergies are really bad here in Vegas. So I'm a little fuzzy today.
So you guys are already starting allergy season. Like yeah. It's like really spring there.
Yes, it really is. And my bottle of allergy meds can tell you it's pretty rough.
Do you have, but are you from Las Vegas originally? Or?
No, I'm from LA originally.
Okay. So do you have allergies in LA or no? Is it like something
I've developed allergies now in LA. So because I lived in Illinois when I did my graduate work, and then I moved to Connecticut. I was at UConn for a couple of years. And now that I've come back to the West Coast, and I think some of it's also like adulthood, right? So, but do we want to check to see that I have the possibility?
Yeah, let me make sure you can share screens, everything. Oops. I think you should be able to. Oh, there we go.
I'm not saying where. Oh, here it is. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I just changed.
Share.
I guess I can see it. I can see it.
You can see this?
Yeah, that looks great.
Okay. Okay. I have it on. Let me actually change that. I need to put it on a different. I'm going to put it on this screen so that I can see my slides as I'm presenting. That's not what I want to do. So I can see you all and my slides at the same time. Well, I'm going to try and do that. Let's see. Able to. Can you see my slides now?
Yes. Yeah, that looks good.
Okay. Yes, I can now see us.
Cool. We could probably get started, and I think people will come in, as they because there was another webinar we had, and I think that was the issue. we got trapped in this like loop of 2 webinars. So, but if people want to come from that one, we'll let them in. So, yeah. So let's get started. Hi everyone. Thank you for being here today. So I'll just introduce myself really quickly. My name is Nivia, and I'm an assistant professor in the Division of Continuing Studies here at UW-Madison. And I'm also a researcher at the Center for Research on College to Workforce Transitions, and the group that's hosting this event. So our focus here at the CCWT is on creating research and training for student service professionals to support students in the transition from college to work. So for that reason, we're very excited about today's topic, which is about supporting students who are pursuing careers in STEM. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Blanca Rincón. Dr. Rincón is an assistant professor of higher education at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. She received her PhD in education policy studies from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She identifies as a proud Mexicana Latina, a daughter of immigrants, and is the first in her family to attend college. Her research agenda aims to advance educational equity for historically underrepresented and marginalized college students in STEM, and specifically Latina OX college students. Her research is supported by the National Science Foundation and has been published in the top journals in our field, including the Journal of Hispanic Higher Education, the Journal of College Student Development, and Teachers College Record, among others. So with that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Rincón. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us today.
Thank you, Nidia. I'm so happy to be here and to share some of my more recent work. I want to thank the Center for Research on College Workforce Transitions, and I especially want to thank you, Nidya, for extending the invitation and inviting me to be in community with you all. So my talk today is on Familia, or Family as Counterspace for students of color in post-secondary STEM contexts. Okay, and I'm going to be sharing some of the work that's come out of a recent publication titled Recreating Family and Reinforcing Pedagogies at the Home, How Familial Capital Manifests for Students of Color Pursuing STEM Majors, with some of my colleagues, Dr. Erika Fernandez, and my doctoral student extraordinaire, Juanita Hinojosa. Okay, so just an overview of our talk today. I'll start off with kind of who am I, what brings me to this work, why we should be studying students of color in post-secondary STEM context, and then kind of the more traditional review of the literature, research question, theory, methods, finding, implications. Okay, so who am I? The study that I'm presenting today is a qualitative study, and in any qualitative study, I think it's important to discuss how we're socially positioned in the world and how that informs our research. So I was, you'll see some pictures here on this slide. I was born in Tijuana, Mexico, and I come from a family of migrant workers. So in the second picture, you see some apple trees, and I come from a family that would, go up to the state of Washington in the Yakima Valley to pick apples. And I grew up in the city of Azusa, and in California. It was a working class, continues to be a working class neighborhood that's predominantly Mexican-American, although that's changing due to gentrification that's happening in a lot of places. I'm the first in my family to attend college, and you can see my siblings there in the picture at the bottom. I went to UC Irvine for my undergraduate degree, and at that time, I like to joke that at that time UC Irvine was not an MSI. It was about 6% Latino, so I had a very different experience than most of my peers. So most of folks who attend UC Irvine now. And then I did my graduate work at UIUC, both my master's and PhD. So I've attended predominantly white institutions for my college career pretty much all my life. And I started actually working at UConn, which is also a predominantly white institution, and now I find myself at UNLV, which is an MSI. So it's just a really interesting trajectory, and one of the reasons why I study what I study, right? Because I'm interested in how institutional spaces shape the college experience. And one of the things I want to share about my undergraduate college experience that I think is relevant here is that I pursued STEM as an undergraduate and actually left STEM. And so now I study the students who leave STEM. And there are a variety of reasons why students leave STEM. And I've been mostly interested in how students' home culture and the college culture either, is congruent or incongruent, right? So altogether, I believe that these subjectivities, these lived experiences are assets that can be leveraged in the research process. For example, it's allowed me to meaningfully connect with the students that have shared their lives with me through this 5-year study. And, I don't know how many folks can say that they've maintained students who maintained a longitudinal qualitative study with the students who start the study. Most of them actually end up continuing on over the course of 5 years. So I feel like part of that was, my ability to build those connections with students and having them feel vulnerable enough to share their stories with me. So I'm extremely grateful for them for doing so, because I think it shed light into some really important things that we should be talking about in higher education. So I'm going to go ahead and start talking a little bit about why we study, students of color in post-secondary STEM contexts. And you've probably seen this figure before, and if you haven't, it's the trends of science and engineering bachelor's degree awarded in the US by race. And so you'll see that most of the lines have been pretty consistent, right? So if we look at Black or African American students or Asian or Pacific Islander students, and between the years of 2000 and 2017, those lines have been pretty consistent. And we see two other lines that have kind of shifted. So we see the Hispanic or Latino, the green line, go up, and the light blue line, or the line representing white students, kind of go down at the same time. And so from 2000 to 2017, we see almost a double of the number of Latino students who are receiving science and engineering bachelor's degrees in the U.S. And while like that's important to acknowledge, I think when we look at the representation of these groups in terms of like the college age population in the U.S., those numbers are there's still really great disparities that need to be addressed. And so I'll bring your attention to the first bar, which is representing the college age population, or the typical like traditional college age population, ages 20 to 34. And then you'll see the blue bar and then the red bar, and you kind of look down across the different types of science and engineering degrees, whether it's at the associate, bachelor's, master's, doctoral level, and you'll see that those bars change, and the number of, for example, Latino students who are receiving a bachelor's degrees is not comparable to the number of Latinos in the U.S. population that are college eligible, right? But we also see that our two-year institutions are doing a really great job of creating access for this population. And so I know that there are quite a few colleagues who are kind of doing this work right now. So Dr. Sarah Rodriguez is one that definitely comes to mind, who's looking at Latino students at two-year institutions. And we need to do more work in this area. So if you're a doc student listening to this talk, I invite you to consider examining this further so that you might learn from these institutions and do better. So one other thing that I want to say about this particular slide is that when we look at underrepresentation or like this disparity, right, we have to talk about like why we see these disparities. And there are several scholars who speak to like this accumulated disadvantage that starts pretty early in students' academic careers, right? So students of color are more likely to attend under-resourced K-12 schools, have less access to rigorous math and science courses, and are less likely to be taught by teachers with math or science backgrounds. And then, once in college, right, they make it, and they're more likely to experience interpersonal and structural racism, isolation, and push-out culture, among other things. So there's definitely a lot that is shaping these outcomes, and it's important to share that along these slides. Okay, so the last figure I'll share with you today is really then looking at, well, what are the implications then for the workforce, right? And we see that people like to talk about like the STEM pipeline, and others have definitely critiqued us using that metaphor. But when we think about that pipeline, we see that it impacts who is then represented in the science and engineering workforce. So we need to address what's happening in higher education, because many of these jobs are, the jobs of the future. They are the higher paying jobs, and there are important equity implications for ensuring that we don't create a second class workforce or recreate the second class workforce, right? Where folks are kind of shut out of these high paying careers. Okay. So I'm going to briefly go over the literature here because I'm mindful of time. So what do we know about the role of family in students' entry and persistence in STEM pathways? So, if we look at the literature, we find that family shapes students' educational trajectories in terms of like their decision to go to college and then selecting their major, right? some of my work has looked at how Latino and Black students center their families in their decisions to pursue STEM careers, often pointing to families' history with health issues or a desire to improve their family's economic situation. And then, once in college, students draw on their family for emotional and social and moral support, right? So as students are, navigating the transition from high school to college, they lean on their families to be able to garner the types of support that help them then persist, right? And I think the last point that I'm going to share here is that family imparts important cultural values, especially the concept of familismo, and there, we see other like collectivism within Black communities that really speak to this sense of a strong identification to the nuclear and extended family. It emphasizes loyalty, responsibility, solidarity, and reciprocity. And these familial cultural values of collectivism and familismo are what's shaping students' extended notions of family, which I'll talk about next. So the literature also finds that students draw from family to activate their familial capital directly from family, right? Whether it's through encouragement or the messagings that they receive around the value of higher education. They also develop or recreate these familial relationships once in college. And so here I'm talking about some of David Perez's work about how students kind of recreate family with peer staff and faculty that mirror these cultural notions of family. And then we know that familial capital also nurtures other forms of capital. So familial capital really serves as the foundation for other forms of capital to exist. And there's some work that talks about how students that use their familial capital to yield provident capital, or I can't pronounce this, familial capital. So other forms of capital that kind of stem from familial capital. And so you probably have figured out by now that my work is really grounded within Yoso's theory of Yoso's theory of community cultural wealth. And this draw is grounded in critical race theory and is a challenge to traditional interpretations of Bordeaux's cultural capital, right? That positions communities and students of color as deficient or lacking capital. So community cultural wealth recognizes the assets, the cultural knowledge, skills, abilities, and contacts that communities of color, and in this case, students bring forward to higher education. So again, this pushes back against deficit-based education models that are built on the premise that marginalized groups lack the ability or culture to succeed in academic contexts. And Yoso posits that there are at least 6 interconnected forms of capital that are derived from communities of color. And so I'll share some of these with you. So we have aspirational capital. I'm not going to go into too much into the specifics here, but I just wanted to mention them. Aspirational capital, linguistic capital, familial capital, social capital, resistance capital, and navigational capital. And for the purpose of this study, we'll focus on familial capital, which is the cultural knowledges nurtured among familia kin that carry a sense of community, history, memory, and cultural intuition. And familia is conceptualized as an inclusive term that accounts for both immediate and extended family, as well as kin-like relationships established with members of one's community. So I like to share that, growing up in a very traditional Mexican family, I would go visit my grandma over the summer in Mexico, and she would introduce me to these strangers who she would be like, this is your tia, or this is your tia. And I was like, I don't know these people, and they're actually, but they became family, right? And they took on these family roles. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that familial capital acknowledges a wide range of familial structures that students and communities of color rely on. Okay, so the two questions that we asked in the study was, how does familial capital manifest for students of color within post-secondary STEM contexts? And here we weren't assuming that it manifests in the same way, right? And then how do students of color activate, extend, and or nurture their familial capital as they pursue STEM majors? And that was really the focus, the large focus of this study, because we know a lot about the types of capital that students bring forward, but we know less about how students then mobilize those forms of capital. So, and specifically, community cultural wealth, when I'm talking about that. So a community cultural wealth perspective to the study of broadening participation in STEM is necessary, right? There's this myth that STEM education is objective and divorced from social issues, and that often isolates students of color, right? So Gutierrez notes, students in STEM are expected to leave their emotions, their bodies, their cultures, and their values outside of the classroom walls, stripping them of a sense of wholeness. And because we know that students of color are more likely to choose STEM majors for altruistic reasons, right? Wanting to help others, including their families, or to address social injustices in the world, and that this sense of giving back and helping others is often instilled within students' families and community. Like, we need to better understand where students find that sense of congruency between home and college cultures, and that's what we set out to understand here. And while I shared those research questions with you, this sub-study didn't necessarily focused on these questions, but the larger study didn't necessarily set out to do that. So the larger study is data gathered from a larger multi-year mixed method study funded by NSF that aimed to better understand how students of color educational and career aspirations change and develop over time. And so through the use of phenomenology and really focusing on how individuals make meaning of their experiences, specifically their college experiences, we've kept hearing, right, that students were talking about family and family in these, pretty expansive ways, and how that was really important in how they were making decisions in terms of their educational decisions and their career decisions. And so while we didn't originally seek to examine family in all its forms as part of this study, our students were telling us that we needed to, right? I guess is what I'll say. And so we did. And so I'll be sharing some of that with you all today. So just a little bit more about the students in the study. So we had 30 students, about half self-identified as women, and about half self-identified as men. 1 out of 3 were the first in their family to attend college. About another third of those students had a sibling who was currently enrolled or who had graduated from college. And then about the last third of those students were second generation plus. About 17 students identified as Latino, Latinx, and 16 identified as Black or African American. And then about 8 of those students identified with 2 racial or ethnic categories. And some of the times that was both Latinx and Black, or Latinx and white, Black and white. So just to give you a little sense of who these students are. And all of the students, what is the same about all these students is that they were all participating in OutSAMP, the Lewis Stokes Alliance for Minority Participation, and they attended 5 institutions on the East Coast that are predominantly white institutions. So all of these students attended institutions where the students of color made up no more than 10% of the student population at their institution. Okay, So let's go ahead and get into the findings. So the first major finding was that students extended these cultural notions of family to the relationships of peers, staff, and administrators to recreate familial relationships and home-like spaces on campus, right? Served as conduits for activating familial capital. And so here we have Lorenzo, who's pursuing a mechanical engineering degree and was interested in pursuing a master's degree. He attended institution, what we'll call institution B, because of the proximity to home. So he wanted to be close to his mother and the school's reputation. When he first started at institution B, he was pretty upset that he didn't make any friends during orientation. And it wasn't until, or he recounted that he was pretty upset that when he came to orientation, he didn't make any friends, but when he participated in ALSAM, Summer Bridge, he met peers who would become close friends and roommates. So he shares, without LSAMP, I wouldn't have met individuals who are the same skin color and have gone through the same experiences, such as myself, or have the same background as me and have the same dreams as me and are intellectually capable and excited about the same things that I'm also excited about, right? So students of color noted the importance of recreating familiar relationships on campus. And oftentimes that meant finding people who shared the same racial identities and experiences. And being in community with those folks on campus, created these like pseudo families for these students, or these what others have called academic families, right? That resembled the home. And that served as these counter spaces. Oftentimes these were multicultural centers, diversity programs, ethnic-based student organizations on campus, where students often described feeling safe, comfortable, familiar, and akin to being at home. And here with Lorenzo, these students would become a primary source of support on campus. And one of the things that isn't noted here is that when I followed up in my interview, he talked about how his roommates went on co-op and he was left alone, right? So oftentimes these individuals that we build these communities with play such an important role that when something happens like that, where he was left alone, taking classes while his peers were on co-op and he didn't have that support, he felt very isolated and he struggled. And so we see the importance that these relationships and these families are for students, and specifically students who are isolated in STEM. These students are often one of the few students of color at their institutions. We see a similar story from Abigail, and Abigail slightly has a different background, right? She has a slightly different story in that she comes from a family, what we call like a STEM family, right? Her dad is a computer engineer and her mom's a nurse. She's pursuing chemical engineering and is pre-med track. She struggled academically still upon entering college and sought assistance from upperclassmen, many of which were in the Black Student Union, family and campus resources. And so she shares, having my own little group of people who understand where I'm coming from, we battle the same problems and issues. It's a great place. I call it a safe space, kind of like to go there and share my problems and interact with other people who are just like me. I can lean on them, they can lean on me. And here she's talking about her peers in the Black Student Union, and she calls them her people and would later go on to call them her little family, alluding to this like family relationship. And she shared that these relationships were strengthened based on like the shared experience of being Black at a predominantly white institution. And often these students, both Black and Latinx students alike, recounted experiences with racism and just a general sense of isolation on their respective campuses. And in these spaces, students didn't feel alone, right? And we see how the Black Student Union in this case provided the space in which students could leverage and mobilize that familial capital and extend it forward to their peers, right? So she says, I can lean on them and they can lean on me. And so from a community cultural wealth perspective, narratives like Abigail's and Lorenzo's reveal how familial spaces are created by extending cultural notions of family and the home, right? These contexts then provide the foundation for cultivating familial lessons of interdependence, such as caring for one another's emotional well-being as they battle similar problems and issues. And so importantly, these familial spaces or home-like spaces didn't require like an actual like physical space or building. And they were also made up of peers, staff, and faculty. As you know, these academic familias that students built often touch several elements of the college experience. You know, students often talked about, you know, having like siblings, mothers, aunts, grandpas. Everybody was in college, right? So, I guess the takeaway point here is that these spaces served as important counter spaces to this larger, predominantly white institution that they were attending, where they could build community and nurture their familial capital. And that's what we'll talk about next. So the second major finding of this study, and I shared with you, this is really what we were looking to better understand, was like, how do students then mobilize their community cultural wealth in college? And so we find that familial capital manifest through how familiar relationships on campus transmit and reinforce pedagogies of the home that foster a commitment to communities, right? So establishing meaningful personal relationships with others, fostering a sense of community responsibility and well-being, and working towards community resilience. And so here we have Lorenzo again, and I'm gonna let you all read this, and I'm gonna take a sip of water. These are two separate quotes. All right, so in the first quote, we see how Lorenzo looked to, and in both of these quotes, I should say, he's talking about his relationship with Dean Anderson. And in the first quote, we see how Lorenzo looked to Dean Anderson for both academic and personal advice and guidance, speaking to the depth of their familial relationship. He notes frequently meeting with Dean Anderson for both and often just checking in, right, to share life updates and how they're doing academically. And this was pretty common across the study. Students talked about just kind of checking in with folks and how that was important, right? These are people who cared about them, and so they wanted to let them know that they were okay, right? And in the second quote, Lorenzo recounted how Dean Anderson shared this adage, time, talent, and treasure. And several actually students actually talked about this at this particular institution in their interviews. And what's important here is that central to this message is the importance of investing one's limited time and sharing one's talents, in this case, students' talents in STEM. So Dean Anderson's message is especially important because of where he works, right? So he works in diversity initiatives. And so for Dean Anderson, having students see the importance of helping him is really about instilling the value of maintaining strong ties to their communities, right? So in helping him, he was helping students, right? Or nurturing students' familial capital by helping students stay connected to their communities. And he modeled these lessons of caring, coping, and providing educación, which informs the emotional, moral, and educational and occupational consciousness of students like Lorenzo, right? And so by encouraging them to ground their actions in their communities, he also ensured that LSM students were also working to nurture familial capital amongst the various communities of students, right? Their home community, their academic familia. And another example we have is from Ada. And so Ada is a first generation college student who entered college as a biochem major. She has aspired to produce low cost therapeutics and pharmaceuticals for people who don't have access to medicine, and she plans to pursue her PhD in chemical engineering. She shared, so when I first came to institution, I was a biochemistry major on the pre-medicine track. So I wasn't an engineer as a junior, and I have a friend who introduced me to NASB. And just being around a whole bunch of people that were dedicated and motivated to the STEM field, wanted to better the communities, I kind of gravitated towards that, and I changed my major that same semester. And so for Ada, her peers in NASB nurtured her desire to give back by reinforcing lessons of responsibilities to one's community. And what I'll say here too is that, you know, Ada later went on to talk about how she navigated to NASB, because what students were talking about resonated with the lessons she learned from her grandmother, which was the responsibility she had of giving back to her community. And so this vision of community uplift carried with it a sense of urgency and responsibility to create change that was also grounded in the idea of giving back to the community, honoring the lessons transmitted to her by her grandmother. And so we see again how their peers and administrators on campus are kind of reinforcing the messages that students receive, like that got them interested in STEM. And in this next example, we'll talk a little bit more about the ways in which students at Familia Capital was nurtured by their peers. So here we have Angel, who's a second generation college student, but the first in his family to pursue STEM. And his sister was a strong support system who we often turned to for advice. He was a mechanical engineering major with a minor in mathematics. And he was also like a really, he also had this entrepreneurial spirit. And he talked about all these little side hustles he had around buying and selling clothes that he maintained in college. Something else that's really important is that he met most of his friends in college at orientation and outside. And so here he shares his experience talking to a peer, one of the ethnically student organizations that he was part of. And this was his mentor. He says, I was like, oh, retaking a class. How could you ever get to that point? That's crazy. So the student was talking to him early on in college that she had retaken a course. And then he shared that, I was in the summer of my freshman year retaking a class, and it kind of made me think, wait, now this coursework is a lot harder than expected. And it kind of also shows me that I'm not the only one who's struggling. And so when I go back to them, and now he's talking about his LSAT peers here, I talk about my struggles because it's like, oh, I've been there, trust me, right? So students, many of these students often experience failure for the first time in the context, in this post-secondary context of STEM, right? And so these peers are modeling getting back up again, right? And that helped them, resist internalizing failure as something that was inherent in themselves, or rather something that they could overcome, right? So they building this like community resilience. And because this lesson was helpful to Angel's persistence in STEM, he made sure to share it with younger peers. And so we see this intergenerational transmissions of lessons learned in the home, while also cultivating community resilience. And so by sharing his experience, we see Angel nurturing Familia Capital by fostering trusting familiar relationships among students of color. Okay, so I talked a lot at you all. And I feel like my mouth is very dry. I want to share a little bit about kind of what we see as next steps for this research, as well as implications for practice. So what we found is that, we need to better understand. So we've focused on like these familial spaces as spaces where familial capital is both acknowledged and nurtured, right? And other forms of capital that stem from that, right? As we think about how students build up social networks that support them and provide resources to help them navigate challenges in college. But we also need to think about the ways that institutions reward or help activate capital, specifically community cultural wealth, right? So better exploring how institutions misrecognize the community cultural wealth that students bring to campus. So here we focus on these counter spaces, right? So these spaces that students were creating for themselves to help them persist. But often the students exist outside of those spaces too. So I think there's a lot of room to understand where students attempt to, mobilize this community cultural wealth, maybe where that doesn't necessarily play out in the most positive ways. And I think there's also, implications in terms of how we better weave elements of family and community into the fabric of colleges and universities so that they better reflect the students they serve. And early on, I shared how I now find myself at UNLV, which is both a HSI and a PC. And I think we're at that point now where we're like, hey, our institution can do so much better in serving our students. And so how do we bridge, students' family and community cultures with the college culture, which should reflect, the students they serve. So with that, oftentimes we find students recount important relationships with other staff and faculty of color. And often these are some of the only faculty and staff of color, and specifically within a STEM context, they're often the only ones. So we have to think about the taxing of these folks. And so we need to do a better job of hiring staff and faculty who reflect, an ethic of care that promote and recognize, these communal assets that students bring forward. So I think that's what I'll leave you all with, is that, I think there are a lot of opportunities, both in terms of thinking about how other other players within the institution are helping nurture and cultivate students' community cultural wealth, and also think about, well, how do we better, reflect staff, faculty, and administrators who will be able to value and acknowledge the wealth that students are bringing forward to college. So thank you so much. I talked a lot, and now I'm interested in hearing your thoughts. So I'm gonna stay here and stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rincón. And if you have questions, you can put them in the chat if you'd like. I have a question that I'd like to ask as everybody is thinking. I found it really interesting, this point of like STEM is not always presented as a community serving or service oriented field, which has always been really strange to me, because I think there's like very obvious ways, right, to connect it to community serving kind of aspects. But I was wondering if students talk to you a bit about like why they chose STEM, and if their motivations come from their families or their family experiences. And I guess like the second part of that question is, in terms of thinking about practice, do you think there are ways that, universities and career services staff can do a better job of communicating that, like, STEM actually is like really community serving and community oriented?
Yeah, those are good questions. So yes, I referenced some of my earlier work and the review of the literature work, and they were these same students, right, where they talked about their motivations for STEM and where that came from. And a lot of the time it was because they wanted to, change the world, as they would say, and they saw injustices, and they attended, high schools that were social justice oriented. And so they were like, I'm really good at math and science, and I can use this to, make the world a better place, whether that was, making medicine more accessible, or whether it was, developing, prosthetics, right? So students were always thinking about how their gifts, right, in math and science could better help their communities. But when they would come to college, they weren't seeing that. So they were like, what's happening? Because they're often sold that, or kind of recruited into STEM, saying like, you can do these things. But then when they were coming to college campuses, they were in these courses where they weren't seeing a connection to practice, or even when they were, that practice wasn't really focused on bettering, their communities and addressing issues of injustices. And so I think to your second question, I think there's a lot of room for us to think about, well, why are students interested in STEM? How do we better create opportunities that allow them to see, like continue to see how they could use those skills within this context? And so here at UNLV, I'm working with faculty in the College of Engineering, and we received an HSI grant through NSF. And one of the components of that project is actually having faculty work with students around community-based engineering projects. And so last year, students designed a community kitchen for one of the, sorry, I'm blanking, one of the food banks in the Las Vegas community. So students like created plans for this outdoor kitchen and built the outdoor kitchen, right? So they saw the direct application of their engineering skills within that context. And you know, they could, and they're engaged in competitions where they're, you know, really they're taking home all these awards around like engineering for the people, right? And so we have faculty who are like, yeah, this is like a no-brainer, right? Like, so we're giving students, like, and especially with engineering, where I think it's like, you know, students are expected to use their skills in practical ways, is that maybe we just change the types of projects that we're engaging students in, right? So that we can continue to cultivate and nurture this community culture wealth for students. And so, so yeah, so and that's kind of where I see like the future of my work, is we're really thinking about, well, where are those places happening amongst faculty, right? Amongst, you know, advisors on campus. So great question. Hopefully I answered that for you.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent example of like how you can just show that to students that this obviously has like very good applications for community-based projects. And you have this really great, I'm pretty sure this is your paper, but you have this really great interview you did with a student, like on a paper that you published a few years ago, where the student's interested in STEM, but he says, I don't want to go on to get a PhD, because I think especially the PhD is seen as like, oh, you're just teaching college students who have a lot of privilege, and it's better to be like a chemistry high school teacher or something. So I think that's also interesting, like thinking about the pipeline, like where do people feel like, okay, at this level, this degree is no longer serving, you know, the community that I want to serve. So kind of interesting.
That was Lorenzo, so I know which.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was Lorenzo, and he's talking about how, like, you know, he wants to get a PhD, so and he loved teaching, and so I was like, so do you see yourself becoming a college professor? And he's like, yeah, no, I don't. You know?
Yeah, I really stuck in my mind, that one, because I was like, oh no, like it's terrible to think, you know, we are college professors. It's terrible to think about people thinking like, oh no, that's not for me, because you can't do any service in that kind of field.
Right. And so I think that's a huge loss for us as higher education community, that we, and oftentimes it's through these you know, nonverbal cues, right? When students are the only ones in STEM, what they find is that they don't belong there, right? And so when they don't see faculty of color in STEM, they see, I don't belong in these spaces, right? And I think some people might dismiss that, but it's really important for students. They're like, I'm not going to be able to teach students like me for my community. I'm not going to be able to serve the communities that I care about. So I don't see myself in these spaces. And so we actually had a really good conversation after the interview to talk about like my experience as a professor, and, you know, teaching at UConn and then teaching at UNLV, and how there are institutions that are serving a large group of diverse students, and diversity in all forms, right? Racial diversity, but also class, you know, sexuality, all of the forms of diversity that I think really, I think planted the seed for him, right? That, you know, this might have been his college experience, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all institutions are like that, and that there's space and room for him to create change in higher education.
That's awesome. It sounds like it was an impactful interview for both of you in a way. Jin, who is actually, Jin is a grad student who works on our project. She had a question for you. So in the chat, she's saying, she's wondering if you have any recommendations for how to train current staff, faculty, and administrators for evaluating students' assets. It's a great question.
Great question. And, you know, I felt like, so the work that I do as a scholar, you know, is very much focused on students, and the work that I do in terms of practice is very much focused on faculty and other people within the institution. So right now, so I talked a little bit about that HSI grant. A part of that grant is actually developing and facilitating. So I'm one of the co-PIs on the project, where I'm training STEM faculty, and right now we're in our third year, around culturally relevant and responsive pedagogies. So it's a year-long training where faculty attend webinars around, things like structural racism, things about like critical reflection, right? Like how do I acknowledge, the identities that I hold and how they shape the ways in which I teach and the things that I'm doing unknowingly, right? I think oftentimes because of this myth and in STEM, a lot of faculty are like, I don't care about those other things, right? And so by saying that, they're engaging in these like colorblind perspectives, and failing to acknowledge that, there is a culture that you're, nurturing, and it might very much be a Eurocentric way of doing and being in STEM. And so I guess with that is trying to have folks first acknowledge the ways in which they're perpetuating these practices, and then kind of learn new ways to engage students in STEM. And so we have actually our last session through this like faculty fellowship. And I should also say that we're also supporting graduate students who are interested in going the faculty route to train them around these culturally relevant and responsive pedagogies. And our last talk is actually next week, and it'll be with Dr. Alex Mejia, who does social justice education and engineering. And so, so I guess to your question, I think part of it is incentivizing staff and faculty and administrators to do something different, allowing room to take risks, right? Because oftentimes when you do something new, it doesn't always go well the first time. And so when students are maybe on the tenure track, faculty may not, when faculty on the tenure track, they may not want to try new pedagogies because they're afraid of how that might impact their, student evaluations. But what room do we allow for faculty to do something different, to do something better? And how to incentivize them beyond a financial incentive? So for participating in this program, we give faculty $2,000, and we still have a hard time recruiting them to participate, right? But how do we incentivize it in terms of our reward structure? If we care about these things, if we care about serving students, then how is that reflected in tenure and promotion? How is it reflected in merit? How is it reflected in our faculty awards? And so I think there's a lot of room to train and support, faculty who may not have had this training, and both, white faculty and faculty of color, because oftentimes we're trained in the same spaces, so we may not know either how to do these things. And so, I think so there's definitely training, but I also think we also have to engage in a concerted effort to change the faculty that we're recruiting, right? Because one of the times, so I teach a class on understanding MSIs here at UNLV, and one of the tensions that we always talk about is how a lot of these MSI grants are often used to train white faculty how to better serve students of color. And so like we want the things that often faculty of color do, because that's, inherent in how we engage in higher education, but without them, right? So we want those, and that's really problematic. So how are we building these pipelines to diversify our faculty? Representation matters, and I see it in the faculty in engineering who are doing this work, who are taxed. And this doesn't help with retaining those faculty, and it leads to faculty burnout. So I think we can do both, right? Train and also diversify faculty, staff, and administrators. Great question. Okay, I see another question.
Yeah, this one is from Ross, who is also our colleague here at CCWT. And so he's says he's backing off of Jin's question, and was wondering if you could talk more about practices educators can use to help activate familial capital on your campus. So your suggestion to develop spaces that reflect the cultural aspects of home in particular seems like it has so much potential. And I'm wondering at what other practices you would suggest.
Yeah, and so yes, developing spaces is one, but I also think some of it, some of what helped, what we see in the study around how students activated their familial capital was to see the lessons that they learned in their house reinforced by staff and faculty, right? So, or peers, right? So what they cared about. So we're like, so if I think about Ada, right, and her grandmother and instilling this value in helping others, right? So even just having those messages reinforced by others is a way of nurturing and cultivating this familial capital. There are also other practices that other institutions are doing, and I'm going to point to Paul Quinn College. I don't know if folks are familiar with this HBCU, but they're trying this new model where when students are admitted, they get to bring someone along with them, right? And so they can choose to bring a family member to attend college with them. And so they like gift college to someone else, but they go to college with them, and they have these like flexible like college, so like a lot of it's like online, but it's essentially making it so that, you know, students, especially students who might be the first in their family to go to college, aren't doing it by themselves, right? And so I think making going to college and being in college a family affair is one way of doing that as well, right? Or like there's a lot of those like family visits that are done, like are making sure that they're bilingual, right? Are they in Tagalog? Are they in Spanish, right? I think there are a lot of like simple ways that I think sometimes I'm like, wow, like our website's all in English, but we're saying that, you know, we have a family page, but it's all in English. What about, you know, students and families that don't speak English? What about if they speak Spanish, right? And so thinking about simply how do they access information so that they know that they're that they feel comfortable about sending their kids away. I think a lot of students of color, especially those who are first generation, kind of struggle with like their families not feeling safe about sending their kids away to college. And that was my experience, right? And I think a lot of it was because it was so unknown, like what was going to happen there was unclear to my parents, right? And so I think had they just known more about what that would look like and that I would be safe and cared for, I think it would have alleviated a lot of anxieties. I share with my students in my classes that when I was deciding to go to college, my dad's a carpenter. He took out a map and a protractor and drew a circle around my house. And he was like, you could go to college here, right? And so like that really speaks to like the anxieties that families have around, you know, I think losing their children and having them change. And so I think it doesn't have to be that way, right? Like students could have a college experience that simply just reinforces those valuable lessons in the home. And I want to acknowledge that there are also like lessons in the home that are not helpful, right? Like I think I want to be clear that this particular study was focused on family and some of those lessons that help them persist, but there's certainly some lessons that are problematic and need to be challenged. But and I just don't want to romanticize that, right? But I do think that but I think there are like these simple ways that we could you know, nurture and cultivate students' familial capital and other forms of community cultural wealth. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very innovative idea, bringing someone to college. Yeah, last night I went to the adult student reception here, and it was surprising how many students said that they, you know, they're older students, that they have a child at UW, and that their child going to UW was very important for them enrolling as an undergrad in UW, and that they kind of helped each other, right? Like navigate college. one of them 18, the other 50 something, right? So I think that's just a really cool idea, kind of in like multiple directions. I'm thinking about small ways to implement things like that, like bringing families in is really a really good idea. So yeah, thank you for those the insights and observations. And I guess we're at time now, but I wanted to ask if anyone has any final questions before we wrap up. If not, I just want to thank you again, Dr. Rincon, for coming, taking your time to talk with us about your research. So
thank you for having me. And feel free to reach out. My email is blanca.rincon@unlv.edu. Right, if you have any other questions. Appreciate y'all.
Thanks so much. And thank you for coming over your lunch hour, everyone.
Adios.
Adios.